Hey everybody, I'm Ken Newhouse, and welcome to the world's biggest client acquisition show, the Get Clients Now podcast, where I interview the world's leading experts and extract from them the strategies, systems, tools, and tactics that are delivering real-world results for small business owners and entrepreneurs around the globe. Hey everybody, Ken Newhouse with you today, and on this episode of the Get Clients Now podcast, I'm going to show you how to supercharge your marketing and advertising by hitting the emotional hot buttons of your prospects and clients. And as many of you know, I've been a direct response internet marketing copywriter and consultant for about 15 years now, almost 16 years now, and the majority of the success that I've enjoyed over that time has occurred as the direct result of me being able to first understand and then leverage amplification effect. So what exactly is the amplification effect? And how can it help you supercharge your marketing and advertising? And another question that's even more important is, ultimately, how can it help you get clients now? Well, here's the best way I can describe the amplification effect. The amplification effect is that unseen force in all marketing and advertising that can literally take, as an example, say $100 that you invest in a single ad, all the way through a series of complex marketing campaigns, and transform that into $500 or $1,000 or more in sales, right? The amplification effect is really that unseen force in your marketing and advertising that exploits existing desires that are commonly shared within a given market. So whatever market it is that you're serving, there are existing desires that are commonly shared among those people, your prospects, your clients within that marketplace, right? So the power, the force, the overwhelming urge that people have to essentially, as an example, own stuff. This is the force, the overwhelming urge that people have to literally to own stuff. This is the force that makes advertising work, and it literally comes from within your market itself. It does not come, this is really important, it does not come from your marketing. So the words, the images or symbols that you use in your marketing, they simply cannot create the desire to have your product or service in your prospect's mind, right? They can increase it if it's already there, but they can never create it. So ad copy specifically, the written or spoken messaging in marketing and advertising, is really what makes or breaks the campaign. So it can be very, very powerful, but, and this is really important, this is a really important but, guys, so pay attention. It can only take the existing hopes, dreams, like fears and desires that exist in the hearts and minds of your prospects, and then focus those existing desires onto your product or service, right? So if you're a business owner, entrepreneur, or a professional service provider, I want to actually point out a really interesting observation to you right now. This is what I would call a writer-downer, okay? So when it comes, right, professional service provider, I want to actually point out a really interesting observation to you right now. This is what I would call a writer-downer, okay? So when it comes to getting more clients, specifically, we're talking about your marketing and advertising, your primary responsibility is not, right, in quotations, it is not to attempt to create this mass desire in your marketplace, in your prospects. Your primary responsibility is to simply channel and direct that existing desire, the desire that already exists within your marketplace, channel that onto your products and services. Now, actually, it would be impossible for you or me or anybody, really any business owner, to spend enough money to actually create this mass desire if it doesn't already exist. It's really important to understand because I see a lot of you guys are literally, whether you realize it or not, you're trying to create a desire that doesn't exist, right? You're trying to sell and market and advertise your stuff, whether it's a product or service, based on what is important to you, not what's important to your clients. Exploit this mass desire if it already exists within your market. So another point, this is why if you think about trying to build a brand in a market, if you're trying to build your brand within a market that doesn't already have at some level an existing mass desire that can be literally focused and then attached to your products or services, you're probably, if you haven't already, and I've seen it just countless times, that's going to lead to failure, frustration, and certainly monetary loss. And remember, we're all in business to make a profit on purpose. That's one of the things I really believe in. So the business owner who actually understands how the process works and then can actually invest the time necessary to first, this is important, identify the primary mass desire that's driving your marketplace, right? And then you can take that and craft your marketing and advertising messages so that they focus the mass desire onto your products and services. If you can do that, if you can be the business owner who does that, you're going to be one who's taking the lion's share of money, clients, business, market position in your marketplace, right? Now, I'm really super excited about today's call today for several reasons. Paul's our guest. Paul Connor from Emotive Analytics, right? Because we're going to actually teach you first how to identify your market's mass desire. And then we're going to talk about the emotional trigger or triggers that are driving the majority of sales in your industry. This is a very, very important training today. Now, once we've done that, I'm actually going to show you how to create marketing and advertising that focuses this mass desire solidly, like anchor it, just permanently attach it, right, onto whatever it is that you're selling. Could be a product, could be a service, it doesn't matter. So if you can get this process down, it's like giving you a license to print money, and that is no exaggeration. And certainly like it's a license to print money legally, right? So we don't want to do anything illegally, but that's my point. It sounds like an exaggeration, but I promise you it's not. If you can get this nailed down, it's almost like being able to print money on demand, literally, right? Now, as I mentioned before, joining me on today's call is one of the world's leading authorities in emotional-based research and marketing, and that's Paul Connor, who's the founder and CEO of Emotive Research and Marketing, and that's Paul Connor, who's the founder and CEO of Emotive Analytics. How you doing today, Paul? Good to have you.
Doing quite well. Thanks for having me this afternoon in the podcast. I'm happy to talk about emotions and how they affect consumer behavior.
I certainly do appreciate you taking the time to do the show with us. This is certainly a guest that I've been very, very excited to talk to. I know we've talked a bit in the past. I interviewed you for the next book I'm working on, but I'm really excited to have you on the show as well. So the topic of today's show is how to supercharge your marketing and advertising by hitting the emotional hot buttons of your prospects and clients. If you want to add to that or subtract, certainly feel free to do that. But what I'd like to ask you first, Paul, what would you say are the emotional motivators that business owners need to be aware of in their marketing? How can they actually, drive and affect consumer behavior?
Well, that's a very big question, Ken, but let me see if I can break it down for you. When you say emotional motivators, basically that's kind of one and the same. Act as motivators, and a motivator means something that is driving me to behave in some way. In this case, it's consumer behavior. So an emotional motivator in my mind is an emotion or a feeling or some sort of affective phenomenon that's really fueling my action to do something. And really, that's what the function of emotions are, to take a look at stimulus, if you will, and that's a metaphorical phrase there. They react to stimulus to inform us about how to react to it, how to behave given a stimulus. And that is the motivation that is behind our behavior. And that is the function of emotions, basically. I like to say that emotions are there to tell us what to do, if you will. Without emotional values operating within us, we would be lost in just thinking about things, and we wouldn't be driven to action. That is, thinking about things, and we wouldn't be driven to action. That is, we wouldn't be motivated to act in ways that will be good for us, including buying products and services.
Absolutely. So from a marketing profit and revenue standpoint, why do you feel like it's important for companies to actually proactively seek by design to connect with their customers' emotions in their marketing and their advertising?
Well, the fundamental answer to that is because emotions and feelings really are behind every behavior that we do, including buying. So if you weren't concentrating on activating the right emotions that motivate people to buy your products and services, you wouldn't really be getting any sales. I mean, that's a little silly, but it's technically correct. So by design, by us as human beings, by design, business people have to attend to well that the businesses are applying.
Absolutely.
But it certainly can lead to or does speak to sales and purchases themselves.
Good. So, Paul, I'm a direct response copywriter, and I've studied a lot. Unfortunately, I never had the chance to meet him. He died well before I ever started really writing copy. But the gentleman who wrote the book Breakthrough Advertising, Eugene Schwartz, and he talks a lot about in a marketplace that mass desire is the emotional driver that's within a given market. And as a marketer, like an advertiser, direct response copywriter, my job, this applies to small business owners and our listeners as well. My job is not to try to create desire for a product when I write copy or create ads. My job is to take that existing desire and then funnel that or turn that or force that onto the product or service that I'm trying to sell. And so with respect to, I think this kind of dovetails in very, very nicely with respect to that, how can a small business owner, whether it's a that how can a small business owner, whether it's a an entrepreneur or professional, how can they begin a structured process of learning about the emotional drivers that their customers are experiencing? Are there experiments that they can actually perform to kind of leverage that information and improve their marketing?
Sure. Again, a big question, but let me see if I can start at the top and get down into specifics to answer it. So you start off with this term mass desire, and really that is just a global term for a strong emotional push or pull, push away from or pull toward a product. So
Absolutely.
definitely there
Yeah.
has to be some sort of an emotional desire or wanting to purchase a product or service. What I would recommend for small business owners, entrepreneurs is first of all, if they're going to structure a process to leverage emotions, they should start to learn a little bit about how emotions operate in the first place. So do a little literature search, do some secondary research on what emotions are and how they work. One thing that's very important about emotions is that emotions are triggered by stimuli in the environment, and you as a copywriter or other advertisers, the words that you put on paper or in ads or however you communicate the words that you use are stimuli
Triggers.
that trigger
Yes.
various emotions,
Yeah,
right? So
absolutely.
you have to come to know the words that will trigger the specific emotions that drive the behavior you're interested in. It's true that different emotions will activate different types of behavior. So, for instance, a product that's all about, I don't know, sporting goods, for instance, a Nike company like that is going to want to use words that trigger something like excitement or even pride, perhaps, versus another company, let's say a Hallmark that's in even pride, perhaps, versus another company, let's say a Hallmark that's into greeting cards. They may not be as interested in excitement, at least not the same excitement as Nike. They may be interested more in love and emotions tied to friendship and maybe more calmer emotions like that. So, in studying emotions in the first place, you come to know, first of all, which types of emotions are available to you. Then you got to know what the strategic goals for your product or service are and match up those strategic goals to the emotions that will drive the behavior. And then on top of that, you have to know what the triggers are in your advertising, promotion, etc., that will activate the emotions you're seeking. Now, there's a lot going on there. When we get down to the research process, there are various ways to conduct such research studies. Uh, I would say for small business owners and entrepreneurs, the best approach to begin with is just start talking to people about your products and services, get their open ended reactions to how they feel about using and buying your products and services, and just see what types of emotions come up. And you can ask them directly questions about how does that make you feel? Can you elaborate on your feelings a little more and start to get at it from that point of view?
One of the things that I actually like to do to help people understand when I talk about triggers and emotions, and this deals specifically with the topic of intrinsic value. When you sell something, whether it's a product or service, and let's just go with a product. If we were selling cars, you've got intrinsic value of the car, and then you've got practical value of the car. And so, as an example, is an Audi A8, and then if we compare that with a Bentley, 10,000, the Bentley GT, which in fact are both cars are owned and share similar parts created by Volkswagen. But the Bentley has a much greater intrinsic value, and it sells for over 330% more than the Audi. When both cars, practically speaking, can transport you from point A to point B. They can carry stuff, so on and so forth. But it's the emotional drivers, the triggers that are associated with it. I may not be saying that correctly from a research standpoint, but from a copy standpoint, the intrinsic value of a Bentley is much greater than that of an Audi, even though the practical value of the steel and the rubber and everything else in the cars are the same. Another example would be I'm holding a bill in my hand right now. It's actually a $20 bill, but I have it in my hand to actually remind myself to kind of bring this up. I can take a $100 bill and a $1 bill and put them side by side, and the practical value of both of those bills is essentially the same. I think it costs maybe 6 cents. I think for the new $100 bills that has that little, I think for the new $100 bills that has that little security strip, maybe 8 or 9 cents. But practically speaking, the value is essentially the same. Ink was used, same paper. The intrinsic value of a $100 bill is much, much greater because of the message or the emotions associated with a $100 bill. Certainly, if I offered you $1, you wouldn't be as excited or emotionally driven as if I offered you $100 for something. And so I just wanted, from a marketing standpoint, everything that Paul is telling us today is very, very important. And I want to thank Paul for actually taking the time to do this show, because most of the time he's working with Fortune 500 companies. And so for a person of his caliber, his expertise, his knowledge, to actually take the time to help out small business owners, and I know a lot of you are, 7 and 8 figure businesses, the fact remains is that this is gold. What he's giving us is really solid information. So I really want you to take the time to listen to him very, very closely. Paul, if I could, can you tell me what high impact emotional motivators, what some examples of those might be, and why should we, I know you've kind of covered this already. Some of my questions almost seem redundant because of your answers are just so good. But at the same time, what are some good emotional high impact motivators, if I could, and why should business owners close attention to those?
Sure. Before I get to that, I thought you were going to ask me about intrinsic value and all that. So let me comment just for a minute
Sure.
On what you were commenting on a second ago. By intrinsic value, I'm going to say that that's the same as emotional value over and above whatever functional features are associated with the product. So
absolutely.
That really goes to the area of branding very quickly, right? So when marketers try to brand their products and services, even though the materials that make up a product service may be exactly the same as their competitors, they want to instill different strengths of emotion, different types of emotion to their brand versus the competitive brand. And the way they do that is through the words they use in their advertising, the images they use in their advertising, the experiences that they create with their product usage, if you will.
Right.
And what happens then is that the feelings that people have about these communications and product experiences that they associate with their products really get imprinted in people's memory. And that's how the intrinsic value is established and how it continues over time. The more frequently that you associate and more consistently that you associate the emotions that you're interested in with these features that you have in your product, the more those intrinsic values, those brand emotions will be tied to your brand and then can differentiate your brand from other brands. And it really then gets into this high impact question that you asked me about. And it gets into another question I think we've discussed before, the strength of emotional connections. Emotional connections are strengthened and they become high impact motivators by consistency of the emotional associations that you have and that you communicate with your products and services and the emotions, and the relevance that they have for people's goals. By relevance, I mean how much are they actually also associated with people's goals, like achievement or friendship or goals like that people may have in their lives.
Right.
So it's all in an associative process, and the consistency with which the emotions you're interested in and the triggers you use to create those emotions around time, which then lead to more consistent sales, the lifetime value of a customer, so to speak. So consistency and frequency of these emotional associations with the features of your product and service are extremely important to create getting back to your original term, the intrinsic or the emotional value of your product or service.
Okay, well, you actually just triggered something else in my mind. I didn't actually have it written down, but this is a perfect example in more technical terms of why it is important to craft a laser-focused, benefit-laden, emotional, what's the word? How do I want to say this? Emotionally stirring, connecting, unique selling proposition. And then, as Paul just said, use that message once you've got a good one that's going to trigger and connect and I guess influence the right emotions for people to buy your products. Use that in all of your marketing, all of your communications, everything applications, everything else, and that goes in line with consistency as you just mentioned. So having said that, Paul, talk about emotional connections if you could, and the relationship between emotional connections and then the lifetime value of a customer or client.
Well, anyway, emotional connections is another term that could have multiple meanings. One meaning is just a personal connection, if you will, right? A relationship with a certain product or service might be considered what people call an emotional connection. In that case, we're talking more about personal bonds and relationship bonds and emotions that are connected to my own personal style, my own personal self-identity, and things like that. So emotions that are related to that, when we get down into the emotional sphere, we're talking about liking and loving and respecting and feeling good about myself, maybe even pride. Self-pride can be an emotional connection in that sense of the word. So as long as the type of emotional connection you want, then you need triggers that go to those certain types of emotions. However, more generically, an emotional connection in terms of a strength of a connection, how strong is a connection, really are created through two mechanisms, if you will. First of all, the frequency with which a certain emotion and a stimulus are connected. That is a brand, a product, or service. If you're consistently connecting your brand, your product, or service with an emotion of interest, it could be excitement, it could be happiness, it could be calm, it could be any emotion that you want. The frequency with which you tie those things together strengthens the connection, if you will, as well as I said a minute ago, the relevance to a goal. So your product or service may speak to a different goal that a person can have. Some studies say that people who are younger and who are just some studies say that people who are younger and who are just maybe starting in their jobs are very achievement oriented. If you get older in age, you're not so much interested in achieving, you're more interested in relaxing or feeling calm, etc. So depending on who your target is, you can speak to different goals that they may have for their lives. And then you have to tie the emotions to the goals of particular individuals, and the relevance of the emotions to the goals creates a stronger connection, if you will. So however you want to approach a stronger connection, you will get a longer term value of your product or service for your customers or your clients. Because again, the stronger those connections, the longer they last, and therefore the more they will motivate people to keep buying your product or service, therefore give.
It just does seem to me, first of all, from a marketing standpoint, I study marketing a lot, and I study copywriting a lot. I still rewrite sales letters from the old days. Really really well written, just powerful sales copy. But a lot of what you're telling me, I just feel like, given all the resources I've had, I still feel like there's a tremendous opportunity here for business owners to add a lot more value to their company by actually understanding all the things that you're talking about on a much deeper, more practical level. And so, with respect to your company, Emotive Analytics, what can our listeners do? How can your company help listeners to capture more of this data and then interpret the data in a way that is actually going to help them improve their marketing, improve their responses, improve the relationships they're having with their customers, clients, or patients, and actually monetize it, make more money in their business? How can you help? Because it seems to me this is literally an untapped, at least for the people that I deal with, this is literally a huge opportunity that's gone overlooked.
Yeah, I guess there are two ways generally. First of all, I think an education is very important. I kind of led off with that in our talk that
right.
Companies can call me and we can sit down and I can just tell them about how emotions work and how the emotional process works. That's probably a better term for emotions because it is a process. So how the process works, emotions combined with experiences that people have, the stimuli that they encounter, the cognitions that they have, the thoughts that they have, the goals that they have also enter into the process of emotions driving behavior. But that being said, the first step I think would be for me to consult with people and to teach them about how it works. And once we get there, then I think my clients and people seeking help in this area need to sit down once they realize that emotions are really behind behavior so strongly. They need to sit down once they realize that emotions are really behind behavior so strongly. They need to figure out a couple things. First of all, what are the emotions that are important for them to activate given their product line? They may be emotions that are tied to their strategic objectives. They may be more emotions that are tied specifically to the nature of their product or service. I mentioned greeting cards before, so love might be, very much tied to greeting cards. But find the one or two emotions that are really important that you think you want to communicate to activate the behavior that you're interested in. And then the third step then would be getting into conducting research. Now, there are many research techniques that can be used to study the emotions that people have for your products and services, and to see which ones are actually driving to the purchase. Probably don't have time to go into all those words and the words that they use and the tone with which they use them. If you really want to get fancy, you can get into more what are called psychophysiological techniques that can scan the brain and see what people are feeling through their brain reactions to stimuli. They can do scans and look at the bodily reactions that get into heart rate, get into facial expressions, get into other biometric data that you can look at to measure emotions. Now, those are a little more sophisticated, more pricey than the first ones I mentioned. And then there are other ways to do it through online surveys is a big approach that can be used to measure emotions. So the third step in using my company to help would be to start designing some specific data collection techniques that can have people see, okay, what are the specific emotions, and are the emotions I'm interested in, are they using my company to help would be to start designing some specific data collection techniques that can have people see, okay, what are the specific emotions, and are the emotions I'm interested in, are they the ones that are really driving the products and service sales that I'm interested in as well?
Over the years, it's been my experience that, whether we're talking again about business owners, entrepreneurs, professionals, most of them don't understand that literally virtually almost every product or service has an emotional component to it, and they don't understand, especially in a like a B2B setting. That even though as an example, you're in a business and you're selling to other businesses, there's still an important distinction that is almost universally overlooked in this situation, especially in the B2B space, when you're selling products and services to other business. What are your thoughts on this?
What you're saying is very true, and it is a challenge for me in my business to convince people that are asking me, well, they're telling me my product, which is nuts and bolts, is not an emotional product. People don't have emotions around nuts and bolts. Well, in fact, they do. That's just because of how we are made as human beings. Right. Our brains and our bodies are designed evolutionarily to have emotions because we have to survive, first of all, and then once we survive, the goal is to enhance our well-being. And that's what emotions do. One very prominent emotional researcher is Carol Izard. I think he's at the University of Delaware. And in some of his writing, he just makes the blanket statement, there is no such thing as an affectless mind, an affect being a synonym for emotion.
Right.
Our emotional systems are always on for our benefit.
Yep.
So, and I also make the statement, which raises eyebrows, that there is no such thing as a completely rational. So, and I also make the statement, which raises eyebrows, that there is no such thing as a completely rational decision.
Correct.
Because even if we think we're thinking rationally, which we can be, rationally being meaning that we're logically weighing the pros and cons of the features, etc., our emotions are examining our logic. They're examining our thinking, and they weigh in, metaphorically, if you will, they weigh in to tell us whether our thinking is going to lead us to either our survival, to be very extreme, or our well-being if our thinking leads us to behave in a certain way. That's the function of emotion, and that's why for any product or service, emotions are active. they're informing us. And what's probably also more important to convey is that we're not even aware of that this is happening. Sometimes people evaluate feelings, then they must not be having emotions. And that's not true at all. Emotions operate in large part non-consciously or subconsciously. Yep. Because we don't have time to think and consciously evaluate how we're feeling about things. So our automatic subconscious processes do that for us in the background.
Just to a good point that you and I talked about earlier. First, my point, just real quick, from a marketing standpoint, the reason business to business really deals a lot with emotions is because it's still one human being selling to another human being or multiple human beings. So it's not a literal business, a sterile dead entity that's selling to another sterile dead entity. These are people selling to people, and so therefore there is no real business to business. It's still people selling to people. And then some of the things you talk about really again trigger in my mind a lot of the work done by Dr. Cialdini, like social proof. I mean, a lot of social proof triggers we really don't stop to think about. It's not a conscious thought. So if you told awesome and exciting, you're planning on going Friday night to dinner there, and Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, when it should be, the parking lot should be full, and it's empty, instantly and subconsciously, and then it's brought to your conscious mind, hey, something's not right here. So whether they perceive it consciously at some point, how quickly, I don't know, but subconsciously it does register, hey, something's wrong here. And so I totally agree with you. This is so good you're saying this, because you're supporting on a much, on a much more detailed level, the things that I try to express to some of our clients, that all of these things are really, really important. Back to your point about nuts and bolts not creating emotions or having an emotional component. I don't think there's anything, like you said, that we deal with in our experience as humans that doesn't have an emotional component to it.
Yeah, so, and I'll elaborate on that with another concept here that's very true. It's not the features of the products and services that is at play here. It's the fact that decisions are being made. And wherever decisions are being, it's the fact that decisions are being made. And wherever decisions are being made, as consumers, regular people consumers or business to business consumers, right? Wherever decisions are being made, emotions are at play, because that's their function, to inform our decisions, to lead us toward decisions and behavior that's going to be best for us.
Okay, and so back to kind of an earlier question, because I think I got you sidetracked, but in a very positive light. If our listeners or if our clients wanted to actually have some of this type of research done, what are we looking at as far as investment for their business? And obviously that's kind of an open-ended question, but just some parameters, some guidelines, some reference points our listeners could go by, because I do think this is a subject and certainly a methodology and a service, a tool, if you will, for your business that should not be overlooked. That anyone who's really serious about, becoming a market leader, anyone who really wants to be the go-to company, the most sought after company in their marketplace, the brand with the best.
The cost of a study, the investment put out for a study depends on study objectives for sure. But some general guidelines I would say that are probably the low end that people want to think about would be around $10,000 at the very low end to do a study that gets into emotionality in some way, in an important way. Then studies can go up from there into the tens of thousands. Think probably a routine study that I might conduct for people would be in the $30,000 to $50,000 range for any one study. And then when you start bringing in psychophysiological techniques with brain scanning and biometrics of the body, you can start getting into the hundreds of thousands fairly quickly. We're not talking about millions of dollars here, or even $500,000 for any one study. But if you think anywhere from at the low end, $10,000 to the mid-range into the millions of dollars here, or even $500,000 for any one study. But if you think anywhere from at the low end, $10,000 to the mid-range into the mid $10,000, $30,000 to $50,000, then more sophisticated studies start to get upwards of $100,000 and then into maybe even up to a couple $100,000 for a study.
So Paul, what if let's say that I'm a seven-figure business, an internet marketing company or an internet-based business, and I want to create a survey, but I'm really not sure of the best questions to ask. I know earlier you had mentioned, there's one-on-one consulting with you. So if a person wanted to consult with you and then ask you to, suggest questions that might be the best questions to ask to meet their objectives, Are we talking about 10,000, or is that, I don't know what your fees are to work with a person, in that respect?
Sure. If we're talking about just consulting with me, that can even get under $10,000. Actually design and conduct studies, collect data, do analyses, provide reports. Then you mentioned a survey. If we're doing some sort of survey work that gets at emotionality and then ties that emotionality to the behavior of interest, those can range anywhere from the low 20s up to $50,000 or $60,000, depending on the sample size and things like that. So I would say think about $40,000 if you want to put a mid-range in there for conducting some survey work. But then again, if we really want to get fancy and get at what the body and the brain are saying about emotion, we start to get up into higher dollar figures for those types of studies.
Yeah, I just want to interject something real quick for you guys that are listening. If a lot of the clients that I deal with, and especially even myself, to invest $10,000 or $20,000 on a well-crafted website that's pretty run-of-the-mill stuff. In fact, that's lower mid-range investment on a really quality website and all that goes into that. So, 10 or $20,000 on a well-crafted website that's pretty run-of-the-mill stuff. In fact, that's lower mid-range investment on a really quality website and all that goes into that. So I don't want you to think that you actually have to spend $10,000 or $20,000 to really get started with this type of work in your business. Paul, what about a person? Let's say this is a business, could be a seven-figure business, but what if they're at this particular point? Maybe they've invested a lot of money in growth or whatever else, and they're just tapped. They're a little tight on funds. How can they at least get started with this type of work on a lower budget? Let's say they only have $5,000 they could invest at a given time. What can they do with that?
I think with that low, I'd be happy to talk to them for maybe a day and then point them in direction of some self-administered types of survey tools they can subscribe to. And I can also consult with them with the types of question to ask, etc. I will mention, here's a little plug for a product that I have, that we have a do-it-yourself platform that we offer people if they want to subscribe to it. There are various levels of subscription. But using this type of survey technique, people can explore the emotions that are tied to their brands, their products, their services for a relatively cost-effective amount of money. So, for instance, a study might be conducted for as little as about $3,900. That's the lowest level of subscription, plus whatever sample you might bring to the party. So that plus my consulting may get you into around the $5,000 range. But again, we have to look at your needs and everything. But in terms of if we're talking about a $5,000 budget, I'm happy to consult with people, put them in the right direction, and put them on to products and services that are more do-it-yourself things that may be able to help them.
That's very, very reasonable. Certainly, that's very reasonable. Is there a particular link? I have one more question, but before I don't want to miss this opportunity, I will actually, if you want, I would like to put links to this type of service, the dashboard you just mentioned in the show notes. But if a person was going to actually go there now to look at it, what's the URL? Do you have a URL for that, or is there a place to go?
Yeah, it's www.emotiveanalytics.com/IEPROU. That's all one word, IEPROYOU.
So IE like India Echo Pro, phonetically correct?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. Last question. Let me see if I ask this right here. Okay, so yeah, this figures on my mind. So if I were to compare, I want to assume that the marketing and the advertising being done in my example / question here for you, I want to assume it's of the highest caliber. So it's not like you've got a high-end copywriter like me doing direct response and then someone else on the other side who really is just a rank amateur doing marketing, just a rank amateur like image advertising or just straight brand advertising. Let's assume they're both of the highest caliber. I know in almost every case, not every case, but virtually every case, that the return on ad spend is going to be greater with direct response over brand marketing, just simple image advertising or Me Too advertising. And I know I'm getting into some of the marketing terms. You may not be familiar with some of the things I say, but I'm sure a lot of it you are. If I take this into a different direction based on what I just said, in an equally important direction, what kind of advertising is more important? Like rational-based advertising, or just purely emotional-based advertising, or is there kind of a good mix of the two?
Well, again, that's a really good question. So I wouldn't say that either one is more important. Um, Everything depends upon what your objectives are in a certain situation, right? But let me say, just generally speaking, um, it's very important for long-term lifetime value to develop emotional connections that can inspire people, that can motivate people to select your brand, your product over competitive products, right?
Yep.
And especially in situations where they're not rationally thinking about your product and services. Situations like if I'm just sitting on the couch lounging around and I'm not motivated to think hard, I don't want to concentrate, then the what we call image advertising uh, can still have an effect because it can plant the seeds in your subconscious mind that when a buying opportunity presents itself, then you will quickly be led to the product or service that had a good effect on you when you were just lounging around and not thinking hard about things. On the opposite end of that, image. So you're shopping, you have 10 minutes to get in and get a present for your son or your daughter or your mother, or your father, whatever, you're in a hurry, you don't have time to think or you don't have the resources to think, then whatever branding intrinsic value set up in those image ads takes over if it's strongly implanted in your brain, and it leads you to purchase the product or service that is strongest in terms of your emotional connections in your brain. So that image advertising that you speak of is extremely important, not for at the moment decisions that I'm going to make, but for decisions over time when I'm in situations where my thinking is really not operating very much.
Okay, and so in the context of a small business owner, as opposed to, say, a Fortune 500 company, and I will just parrot the words of Eugene Schwartz, we don't have enough money. A single person doesn't have a Fortune 500 company, and I will just parrot the words of Eugene Schwartz, we don't have enough money. A single person doesn't have enough money, first of all, to create a specific desire in a marketplace. They can only direct it. But as a small business owner, the amount of money that it takes, my whole take on business, Paul, is I'm in business to make a profit on purpose. And so other than my values, and I think my values actually, my values and my beliefs, those things and my principles, those guide my decisions in business first. But after that, every decision I make really must be filtered through, you know, is this going to be something that's going to be profitable for me, or is it going to be essentially, and it certainly provide value for those people that I'm working with. Obviously, I don't, I assume that everybody that I work with, and certainly that's my intention, is to literally provide extreme value for my prospects and my clients. And so, given that, when I made the is that in order to create the level of awareness so that later on that emotional trigger or that trigger can take place, on a spur of the moment, most small business owners don't have the money or the time to invest in that much marketing and advertising, whereas direct response, by the very name, of that methodology, is you run an ad and it will generate a direct response. And based on that response, you measure, you either tweak it and improve it, or you scale it or whatever, or don't run it again based on your response or lack thereof. So with respect to people who would be listening to this show, my strongest recommendation is, if you've got the money over time and you want to try to do the branding thing, that's great. But literally, if you're looking for a quick response, the fastest way to generate revenue from advertising and marketing is through direct response. I'm not disagreeing with you. I just wanted to put that caveat in there because, to really invest money in branding your company, that's a lot of money. That really does require disagreeing with you. I just wanted to put that caveat in there because, to really invest money in branding your company, that's a lot of money. That really does require a huge amount. And one of the problems that small business owners face, as an example, when they're told, let's say in this case, I'll use an example like a person selling radio advertising or newspaper advertising. Well, they'll say things like, and I've heard it myself over the years, well, you have to run this 15 or 20 times before people become aware of who you are. Well, awareness does not translate into sales. I mean, there's a whole lot of psychology here that we're not discussing, but I don't disagree with you, but I just wanted to point out that a small business owner, typically, that would not be my recommendation for them if I was consulting with them. to focus on creating image ads. In the case, I mean, you work with a lot of super huge, world-renowned companies, and so I mean, it's like I'm not saying you work with Starbucks, but like a Starbucks or companies like that, or even mid-range companies can do that. I think one of the things also that comes into play that might have some relationship to that is one of the things that I teach my clients to do is really strive to create celebrity authority in your marketplace. And what I mean by that is, I like to use the example of a doctor. If I go to a doctor, I'm going to see a generalist. If I have a problem, then the next level of authority over that is a specialist. And then the next level of authority over that would be somebody who, I can't think of the guy's name, Dr. Oz. I don't know if he's really that much of an authority, but he's perceived, and we're dealing with perceptions, which that's really all that matters. The perceptions of your prospects and customers, because their perception is their reality. But the higher up that scale you get, the more, the less selling you have to do. The easier it is, I guess, your brand or your identity grows. And so if you can become a celebrity and an authority at the same time, then there's no selling at all. You're actually having people come to you left and right. And so, yes, I agree with what you're saying, but in the context of a small business person choosing which type of advertising. And so if you can become a celebrity and an authority at the same time, then there's no selling at all. You're actually having people come to you left and right. And so, yes, I agree with what you're saying, but in the context of a small business person choosing which type of advertising to run to grow their business, and this could be a $10 million company, I don't know of many cases where image advertising would be the choice. That's why I said virtually every case, direct response is going to give you a faster return on ad spend. I'm not saying never image advertise, but
Yeah. Well, there's a lot going on there, but I guess how I would comment about that is with this statement that whatever type of advertising you're utilizing, you're creating an image, right?
absolutely.
So really, almost any advertising can be categorized as image advertising.
It has an
And
image
so
component to it. Yes, it does. That's true.
that's right. So in that type of advertising, if you don't have the money to spend on real pretty imagery and symbolic things that
Oh,
on
that's it.
creating a sense of urgency
Yes.
in a sentence.
Yes.
So that in and of itself is creating not only imagery in the types of words that you choose,
Yes.
but also it's creating emotional activation. For instance, in the sense of urgency, a phrase is only four more left, so hurry up or else you're going to be lost here.
Right.
Really gets at we talked about high impact emotions earlier.
Yes.
That's a very high impact emotion, the sense of the fear of losing.
Yes.
Right?
Fear of loss. Absolutely.
We as human beings are more motivated by a sense of loss
Then we are
or
gain.
the fear of loss than
Yep.
we are an equal value of gain, because it goes back to our evolutionary substances that said, hey, we have to live. So dangers in our life, fear of losing dangers in our life, fear of losing something are much more impactful than the joy of gaining anything. So in those situations where your clients don't have the money to spend on, Hollywood producers to put together their ads and all of this, and don't have the money to spend to have enough frequency to gain a high level of awareness, it's just as important to use the right words in the right situations, which gets to targeting as well, targeting people and
Absolutely.
situations where they are, the channels that you advertise in, etc. But in any case, in anything that you do, you are putting out there stimuli that our emotional systems react to, and therefore an image is formed.
Yes, and I think the whole thing with that last question and my comments and your comments, I think really was a language differentiation as far as how you describe things and how I describe things.
Sure.
But I totally agree with what you're saying. Is there anything you've given our listeners a tremendous amount of value today? Having said that, is there anything else you want to add? Because I really do think you've just really over delivered today.
I guess I wouldn't add anything, but let me see if I can just put it together briefly with what's really important to know about emotions. First of all, it's very important to know that emotions are always on, so to speak. Our emotional systems are always scanning our environment for stimuli, and they're reacting to stimuli that can impact not only our survival, to be very extreme, but our well-being. And so emotions are always impacting our decisions. So to think that there's such a thing as a rational decision versus an emotional decision just isn't true. So step one for all of your clients and business people that you're speaking to, accept emotions as something really activating your particular product or service category, and then can differentiate your product from your competitors.
I'll just add one more point. I think that's why women have an easier time writing really good copy and being good marketers in a lot of ways, because I think just intuitively they're much more in tune with emotions than men are. I think men are, correct me if I'm wrong, but just my perception is that men overlook this a lot when in fact women are just inherently genetically more in tune with emotions than men are. I don't know what your thoughts are on that, but
well, I don't know if I can get to the genetic, but certainly socialized. Men are more socialized not to be emotional beings, and therefore not to rely upon their emotions, which is they're kidding themselves, because
right.
They're relying on their emotions whether they know it or not.
Absolutely. So, hey, listen, Paul, great call today. I will follow up with an email regarding the event in September. I would love to have you there, and then we can figure out what the specifics are. Absolutely. So, hey, listen, Paul, great call today. I will follow up with an email regarding the event in September. I would love to have you there, and then we can figure out what the specifics are. But certainly, this has been a very, very rewarding call, not only for the listeners, but for me as well. I've really enjoyed it, and I do appreciate your time.
It's my pleasure. Thank you very much for reaching out, and